power. I was involved in trying to set up a community consultation process in a national park in the Philippines, and the local people said, yeah, we'd love to come to the meetings, but what we need is a bus fare. And they're talking about something like 10 cents to get to the meeting. And the local authority said they didn't have the resources for that. So in terms of making that process work, there was a very minor demand that people didn't want a sitting fee or anything like that. They wanted a 10-cent bus fare to get to the meetings. Those kinds of decisions are really going to affect the capacity of areas to engage. If you have a consultation meeting at a particular time, it's going to affect who can come and who doesn't. So you need to think always about those processes of access to information resources. You need to talk about cooperation and empowerment. So stakeholders must be given the ability to have an impact on the decision-making process. That's a very obvious statement, but if you don't actually have the capacity to change the process, it's pretty stupid being involved and consulted. There has to be understanding and knowledge sharing, and stakeholders should be receptive to the needs of others. We also need to have flexibility. The process needs to evolve to meet the needs of different stakeholders. So there's no point putting in set a process that doesn't change if the issue changes over time, if the needs of the stakeholders changes over time. We need to be always flexible in how we put those things in place. And we obviously have to have a range of methods. Already spoken about the idea of consulting the internet is perhaps not that best system for people who don't have computers. It might be a good system for young IT literate people, but not necessarily the best system for a group of people who don't have access to computers. There's a lot of literature and theory on public participation. I won't go into detail, but if you're interested in this kind of theory, I know you can explore it in more details in Jackie's course during the semester break. But it's just interesting just to reflect on the difference between how political scientists in particular and resource managers, environmental policy people tend to see participation. So there's a lot of literature talking about public participation as a concept, and political scientists often talk about that. In this course, I'm talking more about it as a tool, and this is how environmental activists, development theorists talk about it. So it's a tool to make a difference. So there's obviously implications in those two different definitions. Those who consider participation as a concept view it as an approach, an ideology, or a specific ethos for community development, whereas those who are talking about it as a tool are much more pragmatic. They're talking about change on the ground. They're talking about methods, guidelines, or practice for involving the community in decision making. And Bushi, who was a former member of staff in this department, has written some really interesting things about that, which again are on your webpage if you want to follow up this important topic. If you only read one article on public participation, I think it should be this one because it's just been so influential. It's dated in some way. It was written in the late 60s. You need to remember when it was written and the context of it. So in the late 60s there was a great discontent in North American cities, racial riots, but there was a great call for greater say of marginalised communities in the planning process. And that's the context in which she wrote this article. She suggested that power was central to the concept of participation. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. And as she notes, participation is viewed as the cornerstone of democracy. Yet in reality, it's those who hold the power often reluctant to let go of it. She writes about this, and this lack of sharing of power is a crucial way of theorising about public participation. So Einstein argues that citizen power is greatly increased or diminished through a range of decision-making mechanisms, and she suggested there's three broad levels of this. A level where there's degrees of citizen power, one where there's just some degree of tokenism, and one where there's no participation at all. And many of the examples I've already given you could see could be plotted on that three-tier system. On your webpage again, there's some criticism of Einstein's article, and they point out that her approach was value-laden, implies that some forms of participation are real and others aren't. There's an article there by Dovers, and he talks about how participation is much more complex. Steve Dovers is a member of the Fenner School. I'll get him to come and talk to a later class, a later lecture in this class. He talks about how participation is more complex than the latter implies. Some people may not wish to participate directly, only observe. Others may wish to participate in different ways at different stages in the policy process. So we can't just say this participation process is just like this, the ways in which people want to participate may well indeed change over time as that process, as a planning a program, for example, is developed. And participation may be not the best thing. So there might be other mechanisms through which the community can have a say, and it mightn't be the best thing for the process as well. So we need to think about the role of the expert and the role of the community. In some cases, the expert actually does know things that the locals don't know. So then there's a need for communication between the expert and the locals and a sharing of that knowledge. Okay, the final thing I want to talk about in terms of public participation is the idea of social capital and its importance in terms of making public participation work. So social capital theory was developed by a sociologist, American sociologist, I think, Putman, and he talked about social capital theory and suggested democracy can't endure with if there's a lack of public participation. He describes social capital as a mechanism that enables participants to act together more effectively to pursue shared objectives, a bridge that enhances cooperation to serve broader interests. And I think, again, already in this course we've mentioned Eva Cox's work, an Australian sociologist. She talks about the process between people which establish networks, norms, social trust when facilitating cooperation. And collectively she just talks about that. It's kind of social glue that makes a society works. If you don't have that social glue, I would argue that you're not going to have effective participation. You can't just create social capital as something that involves and develops in the community, and it can be destroyed very quickly as well. So one thing I noticed as a parent of what are now 16 and 18-year-olds is through the 90s, increasingly people found it hard to attend or sit on school boards, sporting groups, sporting associations, little athletics boards. So all these things which the community runs have got harder because people are working longer hours. A lot of those things were hit by the changes in insurance rules. But there's kind of, in many cases, those community groups in Australia are facing a real challenge in terms of volunteers. So volunteering is, I would say, is a really good indicator of the health of the community in terms of its social capital. And in some country towns, it's still very, very strong. In other country towns, it's not. And you need to think about why that's happened. Some country towns where everybody's driving somewhere else to work, that place is going to have a very different social capital probably than one where they're more self-contained and there's local employment. So we need to think about what happens when social capital is lost. Cox argues as people become less involved in the community and withdraw from social networks, they have a less capacity to engage in public life. She argues that this leads to a situation in which extreme opinions and an inability to compromise are fostered, where tolerance and inclusiveness are lost, where unrealistic assessment about what community and government can achieve are developed, and a sense of that everything is out of control and other people are to be blamed is reached. And she argues that is where we are going as a community in Australia. So it's something to think about in terms of our capacity as communities to engage in public participation. If you're asked to think about which process you've been involved in or not, think about why that is. And I'd say it's nearly always time is what we're a very time-poor society these days in terms of the demands on us to increasingly for students to work. So when I was a student, I worked 5 hours a week on a Sunday in a bookshop, and that was unusual. Most people were full-time students not working. So the capacity of students to have voluntary organisations, volunteers on campus has really changed. And a final thing to think about public participation is distrust in government. So some people are saying that public participation is kind of a survival mechanism that now we don't trust government. So distrust between governments and the government is another factor underlying the call for greater participation. Conakry and Conakry have written a book on environmental policy and planning in Australia, and they argue there's a view of a growing scepticism about traditional political practices, suspicion about the motives of government. Participation could in this context be seen as an insurance policy taken out by the public in order to hold governments in check. So I think this is the final slide before we have a break, and I just saw Peter there in the door. So there's some criticism of public process, and again you need to think about these in the tutorials. Its capacity to be dominated by interest groups. So is it the middle class who are dominating the process? So often it is. It will be people who are professionals, the ones going to meetings, not necessarily people directly affected and certainly not representative of the whole body. Often economic interests have tended to dominate in public participation processes. It's diminishing the decision-making role of government. In some cases, I would argue government needs to make the decision. And often it's also encouraged the mobilisation of antagonistic forces. And there's a good article again in the reading about that. So let's take a 5-minute break and we'll resume at 20 past.